morning and to listen to all your appreciations. And I want to appreciate Kip for his warm words. And I also want to appreciate my friend Lynn. I wouldn't be here without Lynn. Lynn was the one who invited me to be here. And who can say no to Lynn? She's never ceases to inspire me, Lynn. So I want to talk to you about the subject, which is sometimes a difficult subject, of how do we deal with conflicts in these turbulent times. And as Kip mentioned, I've been a student of that conflict for practically my whole working life as an anthropologist, as a negotiator, as a mediator. And I want to share with you that I used to think conflict was a bad thing, but I've come to realize that conflict is actually something natural. It's actually part of human life. I mean, in the sense of differences, disagreements, issues, disputes. Who doesn't have conflict in their life? I mean, if I just were to ask you, if you think about how many of you have experienced conflict in your families, maybe recently or over time? How many of you have experienced conflict in the workplace? How many of you experienced conflict in your community? And how about in the wider society? Okay, so it's everywhere, and it's growing. And it's polarizing us. Sometimes it's poisoning our relationships. And it's paralyzing our ability to solve the important problems that we need to solve. And the way I think about it, actually, interestingly, is that actually sometimes we actually may need more conflict, not less, in the sense of we need conflict often to address injustices in the society. We need conflict to bring about changes in our organizations and around us. We often need conflicts to learn, to grow, to evolve. So the problem really isn't just conflict. The problem is the way in which we deal with conflict. And this is the secret, is we have a choice of whether we choose to. We may not have a choice about whether we're going to have conflict or not, but we have a choice about whether we deal with the conflict either destructively, through vicious fighting and arguing, violence, or even wars we're seeing now in the Middle East, or constructively, through listening, through the kind of behavior that I see modeled so well here at Conscious Capitalism, through dialogue, through negotiation, through collaborative problem solving. And that's the choice. So if you were to think about it for a moment, oftentimes when we get into conflict, we fall into what I would call the 3A trap. The first A is attack. We go on the attack. Witness the Middle East, an eye for an eye and we all go blind. Second A is accommodate. We give in, and it leaves us feeling unsatisfied. We give in to the other side. And the third A is avoid, and that's something very common within organizations, within families, is no one wants to talk about it, no one wants to deal with it, and we pretend that it's going to go away, but it doesn't. If you had to think about your own tendencies, we all have those tendencies. Some of us, where's your learning edge? How many of you have a learning edge, or you maybe have a tendency when you get into a conflict of maybe going on the attack? How many that's a tendency? How many would be avoid? How many tend to avoid conflict? Okay. How many would tend to accommodate? Okay. And sometimes it's all three. And that's often what happens is we may avoid for a while, we may accommodate, and then we lose it, and then we go on the attack, and then we say, oh, that doesn't work, and we go back to avoidance. So we go around. And the question is, what's the way out of the trap? And the way out of the trap, I would suggest, is a fourth way, which is to transform. It's to transform conflict, to change the form of conflict from destructive to constructive. We may not always be able to resolve conflict, and maybe we don't even need to. But we always have the opportunity to change the form, to change the way in which we deal with conflict. And that's what I'd like to talk with you a little bit about now is, what are the keys to transforming conflict? And as I do so, I would like to have you maybe have in mind some conflict that you're currently engaged in. It may be a conflict, an issue, a difference, a disagreement, maybe in the family, in the workplace, in the community. Just pick something just so you have that in mind. And I'll try to illustrate it too with a conflict a business conflict that I was involved in as a advisor to one of the parties of a CEO who was actually, I came to some of the early I think, conscious capitalism summits many years ago. A fellow from Brazil who, together with his father, founded Brazil's largest retailer. His name was Abilio Diniz. And he was in a really bitter conflict with his business partner over control of the company. And it led to lawsuits, multiple lawsuits, attacks in the press, character assassination, led to vicious boardroom battles. It affected the parties, it affected their families, it affected the 150,000 employees of the company. It got so bad that the presidents of Brazil and France had to get on the phone to talk about it. And it had been going on for about 2.5 years when I got involved. And so the question is, how do you transform a conflict like that? It was so emotional, it was so personal, it wasn't just a business dispute, and it was all over the front pages of the business papers. And I wasn't sure I could really help, but I went to see Abilio. So we'll take that as an example. What I want to do is I want to share with you 3 basic keys to transforming conflict. Talk about 3 of them: the balcony, the bridge, and the third side. They're all kind of metaphors. And let me just start with the first one, the balcony, for a moment. The question was, in conflict normally, what happens is normally what we tend to do is what I've learned, maybe the most important, one of the biggest lessons I've learned since writing Get EDS, which was about how do you influence the other side, was that the single biggest obstacle to us getting what we want, advancing our interests in a negotiation and a conflict is not what we think it is. We often think it's that difficult person, that difficult party on the other side of the table. What I've learned is actually the biggest obstacle is actually right here. It's me. It's ourselves. It's our own human, very natural, understandable tendency to react, to act without thinking. As the saying goes, when angry, you will make the best speech you will ever regret. And that happens, we go on the attack, or we avoid, or we accommodate. And what you find successful negotiators doing, I find, is the exact opposite of reacting, which is they do what you're doing here, and I've watched you model it, is you take a step back from the situation. And it's almost like you put your mind and your heart on a balcony, which is a place of perspective overlooking the stage on which the conflict is taking place. It's a place of calm. It's a place that you were just in a moment ago when Adair was leading you through that exercise. It's a place of calm. It's a place of perspective. It's a place where you can keep your eyes on the prize. It's a place where you can see the larger picture. So with Abilio, for example, when I met him, the first challenge was how to help him go to the balcony. He was very emotional, very irate, deeply engaged. It was just consuming him, this battle, for years. And I'd been invited in by his daughter and his wife, who were really concerned about him and concerned about where this was going. And so we met, not in the office, but in a more of a balcony space at home, where he was surrounded by his kids. And I was watching. He had a young boy and a young girl, a second family, and they were running around. And I was thinking, what kind of father do these kids actually have? The father is so consumed with this business battle royale. So I asked Abilio, I said, tell me something. What do you want? What are your interests? What do you really want here? And like any good business leader, he rattled off. He had 6 things. He wanted a large amount of share and stock at a certain price. He wanted the elimination of the non-compete clause, 3 years. He wanted the company headquarters. He wanted the company sports team. He had about 6 things. But then I looked at him and I said, Abilio, but tell me something. Help me out here. What do you really want? And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, you're a man who seems to have everything you want in life. What do you most want in life at this point out of this? He looked at me for a long time, and then finally he said, liberdade, which in Portuguese means freedom. I want my freedom. And at that moment, just as in the exercise you were doing a moment ago, I could see the first answer he gave was from the head. You know, it was a very intelligent answer, but the second answer, I could tell from the tone of voice, was from his heart. And this was a man for whom freedom meant something because he'd had the experience 2 decades earlier of being kidnapped for a week, held in a coffin, and was only sort of miraculously released through. And I asked him, what does freedom mean? He said, well, freedom means time to spend with my family. It's the most important thing in my life. And he pointed to his kids and his wife. And it's freedom to make the deals I like to make. So then I thought, okay, how do we get him his freedom? So that's the key of going to the balcony. The balcony allows you that perspective to really focus in behind the positions on what is it that you really want in that situation. We think we know, but we often don't know unless we really go deep. So think about for a moment how you go to the balcony. What do you do to go to the balcony? What do you do to pause for a moment? Just, if you wouldn't mind just calling out, just what's your favorite practice, balcony practice? Breathing. Okay, very simple. Breathing. Okay, you can do that at any time, right? Just take a deep breath like you were doing a moment ago. What else would you do to go to the balcony? Meditation. Count to 10. Cup of tea. Nature. Okay, so everyone has their favorite practices. Those are all very important. These are our natural human capacity. We all have these possibilities. Balcony is a natural human superpower that's latent there that we can unleash. Then takes us to the next step, which is it sets up the possibility of the next challenge. Balcony is a victory with yourself. The next challenge is, where's the victory with the other? And that's the art of building the other side, a bridge, what I would call a golden bridge. Because normally speaking in conflict, what do? We usually take a position, the other side takes a position, we dig in, they dig in, we try to push, they try to push. I mean, let me just illustrate it for a moment here. If you wouldn't mind just putting your hands up. I'm putting my hands up. If you wouldn't mind, put him. Imagine that I'm pushing you, right? Right now, I'm leaning against you, pushing on your hands. What do you instinctively feel like doing? Push back, right? And that's what happens in conflict all the time is I push, you push. And unless one party is overwhelmingly stronger, it just is a stalemate. It goes nowhere. And that's often what happens in negotiation. What you find successful negotiators doing is the exact opposite, which is instead of pushing, they attract. It's almost like this. Your mind is right here, and in a conflict, their mind may be way over here. And we're here in our position, and we're saying, hey, come over to my, you got to get over to my position. You got to take my position. But if you go and put yourself in their shoes for a moment, and that's one of the critical things in building a bridge is that act of being able to put yourself in the other person's shoes, understand how they see the situation. It's not so easy for them to move over to your position because for them, it's like there's a giant chasm like the Grand Canyon filled with dissatisfaction, unmet needs. Well, I'll look like a failure. I'll look weak. It won't meet my needs. There's any number of reasons why they can't adopt your position. And so what this requires us to do for a moment, something not always easy, is to leave where our mind is for right now. Leave where our mind is and start the conversation where they are, where their mind is, where their heart is, where they are. Connect with them, listen to them. That's why listening is so key to this. And then think about how do you build a bridge over that chasm to help them move in the direction you'd like them to move. Because oftentimes in conflict, subtly, it's like, how do I make it harder for the other side? No, your job in conflict is to make it easier for the other side, to make it easier for them to move in the direction you want them to move. So let me go back to Abilio for a moment. So then the question was, okay, got this conflict, he wants freedom, how do we begin to build a bridge? Well, first was how do we make contact with the other side? Because they weren't talking with each other. And his business partner. And I couldn't get a hold of the business partner because, the whole thing. But I was able to get a hold of a friend of the business partner, a mentor of the business partner who was a French banker who lived in Paris. And he said, okay, you want to come see me? You can have lunch with me in Paris. And it's named a date. So I showed up in Paris. went to lunch with him, and he asked me, so why are you here? And he kind of suspicious. And I said, well, I'll tell you why I'm here. I'm here because life is too short. Parce que la vie est trop courte. Because life is too short. It's too short for these gigantic battles where everybody ends up losing. Not only the parties, but their families, all the employees of the company, the shareholders, the whole society. Everyone's suffering because of this conflict. He said, yeah, but how would you, and I think he was taken aback by that, because what I was trying to do was see if we could kind of create a bridge, you know? How could we together help our friends, our clients, help them out of this conflict, help them through this conflict? He said, well, how would you approach it? I said, well, if we could just agree on two things, I think maybe we could make some progress. He said, what are those? And I said, both parties, they want their freedom. They want their freedom to go on with their lives. They want their freedom to do, you know, what they want. And they also have dignity. Neither of them can afford to lose. As things gone so public, they can't afford to be seen to lose in this sense. If we could just base an agreement on those two principles, those two interests, which they both share, freedom and dignity. And what's interesting about when you get down to that level, at the level of where the negotiation was, there's a lot of either or. It's either more for me means less for you, but more freedom for one doesn't necessarily mean less freedom for the other. You could have more freedom for both. More dignity for one person doesn't necessarily mean less dignity for the other. You can have more dignity for both. They're positive sum. So he said, well, why don't you come to my office the next day and let's talk about it. And in an hour in his office the next day, which was a Tuesday, we sketched out what would it mean to apply freedom and dignity to this particular business dispute. That was Tuesday. By Friday, we had both parties sitting at a law office in Sao Paulo, signing off an agreement, putting an end to a 2.5-year dispute that was widely expected to go on for another 7 years, wishing each other well, made a joint speech to the executives of the company, and the dispute was over. And I asked Abilio that night, I said, how do you feel? He said, well, I got everything I wanted. He said, but the most important thing is I got my life back. And I asked the other side too, and they were happy. And not only were they happy, obviously the families were happy, the community was happy. So it was not just a win-win, it was a win-win with a third win for the larger community around them. That was the bridge. And that's the key, is it took going to the balcony to try to build that bridge, but there was a third element that was also necessary, which is what I call the third side, which is normally in conflict, as we can see right now in the Middle East, everything gets reduced to two sides. It's us versus them. It's one side versus the other. It's union versus management. It's Arabs versus Israelis. But in fact, as we know, there's never just two sides. There's always a third side, and that third side is the community, the people around the conflict who are affected by it. It might be the family, it might be other board members, it might be colleagues, it might be coworkers, it's neighbors, it's the community. And this is our most ancient human heritage for dealing with conflict, which is what Tulane was talking about, intentional community, a community that serves as a kind of container within which even the most difficult conflict can gradually be transformed. In this case, in the case of Abilio, it was his wife, Geise, his daughter, Ana Maria, women who were saying, wow, this is going in a bad direction. His staff, they recruited me as a potential third-sider. I then talked to the mentor or the friend of the other party and said, can we, so we created what I would call a winning coalition. A winning coalition for an agreement. That community, that turns out to be the key. So it was those three things, balcony, bridge, and third side, those three together. Balcony is a victory with yourself, bridge is a victory with the other, third side is a victory with the whole. We need those three victories all put together. And those are all three human superpowers. We all have the ability to go to the balcony, as you saw. We all have the natural ability to listen, to build bridges. It's just, they're innate human capacities that we just need to develop. And the community is always around us. So those are the three essential resources I've found that are key. In a moment, in the next session, John is going to have an exercise where you're going to be on the balcony looking at one of your conflicts. You're going to be on the balcony. You're going to in a place of perspective, as you are here at the conference. And you'll have third-siders who are peers of yours who will coach you. And you'll be looking at how to build a bridge so you get a chance to practice this. Let me just sum this up by leaving you with a favorite old story of mine from the Middle East about a conflict that took place between three sons over an inheritance. They had received from their father 17 camels. The father had left the oldest son, he left half the camels. To the middle son, he left a third of the camels. And to the youngest son, he left a ninth of the camels. Well, three sons, it was 17 camels altogether that the father had left. And the three sons fell to dividing up the 17, but 17 doesn't divide by 2, and it doesn't divide by 3, and it doesn't divide by 9. So they got into a big conflict, and it was about to turn violent, in fact, and then the family around them said, oh, you got to calm down here. And they brought in the help of a wise old woman. And she thought about their problem for a long time, and finally she said, well, I don't know if I can help you, but if you want, I have a camel. You can have my camel. So they said, okay. So then they had 18 camels. 18 camels, the first son took 18 camels does divide by 2. So the first son took his half. Half of 18 is 9. Second son took his third. A third of 18 is 6. The youngest son took his ninth. A ninth of 18 is 2. If you add 9 and 6, 15 plus 2, 17. They had one camel left over. They gave it back to the wise old woman. Now, if you think about that story for a moment, that fable for a moment, those 17 camels, it resembles a lot of the conflicts we get engaged in. There's no way to divide it up. There's no way everyone gets into a big conflict. Somehow what we need to do is take a step back from the situation, like that wise old woman, go to the balcony, as it were, look for a bridge, listen, try to be creative about it. And sometimes it often takes a third side. In this case, the families around them and bringing in the wise old woman. It takes the balcony, bridge, and third side to do all three. So again, what happens with conflict is we often we lose ourselves in reactivity, which we all know, and instead we have to do the opposite of going to the balcony. We lose ourselves in positionality. Instead, we build the bridge. We lose ourselves in us versus them dualistic thinking. Instead, we take the third side. So that's the key I've found. I mean, it sounds simple. It's not easy to do, and we'll get a chance to try and do it. But it takes all three. It takes that victory with self that makes possible a victory with the other, accompanied and helped by a victory with the whole, which is the community getting engaged. That's what I've found is kind of like the key. It's a different kind of thinking than the normal kind of thinking where we just focus on just the other side. We have to focus equal attention on ourselves and on engaging the community around us, which is what conscious capitalism I know is all about. Let me just leave you with one thought. I have I'm newly a grandfather. I have a grandson whose name is Diego, who's a year old, and I like to think of him as my new boss. And it's his generation, our children, our grandchildren. The question is, how do we create, as Lynn was saying yesterday, the beautiful world that we all want for them? And the truth is that in this world, no matter how many problems there are in the world, and there are a lot of them, probably there's no problem on earth that we can't address if only we can work together. And the thing that's blocking us from working together, as we can see in this country, is conflict, destructive conflict. So if we can learn to go to the balcony, which is a natural human superpower, build the bridge, another natural human superpower, engage the third side, a third, if we can do that, we can transform our conflicts and we can transform our world. That's my dream. Thank you.